In the spring of 1220, on the windswept edge of Khorasan, where the dust never settles and the sun bleaches memory from stone, a mother stood motionless as her daughter was led away. The girl was 14. Her name was Zaria. She did not cry. She did not struggle. She had seen what happened to those who did. The Mongol soldiers moved with the quiet efficiency of men who had done this 1,000 times before, because they had. And Zaria, though young, understood the terrible arithmetic of conquest. Resistance was not bravery. It was a death sentence signed in blood. Her name was already written in their ledgers, not as a person, but as data. Age, 14. Height, average. Build, sturdy. Eyes, dark. Hair, unblemished. Fertility, presumed viable. Every detail recorded by scribes who followed the army like shadows. Their brushes dipped not in ink, but in the future of empires. This was not random cruelty. This was architecture. The Mongols did not merely burn cities, they repurposed them. And within that repurposing, women were not collateral, they were infrastructure. What happened to girls like Zaria was never chronicled in the grand annals of victory. No court historian praised the reproductive logistics of the Khan. No monument honored the silent caravans that trailed behind the cavalry like ghosts. And yet, their legacy is written not in stone, but in flesh, in the very blood of millions alive today. Modern genetics has uncovered a startling truth. Roughly 1 in every 200 men on Earth carries a Y chromosome that traces back to a single male ancestor in 13th century Mongolia. 16 million living souls. A genetic echo so vast, it can only be the product of a system, deliberate, sustained, and terrifyingly efficient. This was Genghis Khan's true conquest. Not the cities he razed, but the lineages he rewrote. Not the gold he seized, but the wombs he claimed. He understood something that eluded every conqueror before him. Land can be lost. Fortresses can fall. But genes are forever. To grasp how he arrived at this revelation, we must go back to the frozen steppes of 1162, where a boy named Temujin was born into a world of wolves and whispers. His tribe, the Borjigin, was small, poor, despised. When he was 9, his father was poisoned by rival Tatars. His mother, Hoelun, was cast out with 5 children to feed. They survived on wild onions, marmot meat, and the bitter roots of desperation. Temujin learned early, the world is divided into 2 kinds of people, those who take and those who are taken. At 16, his betrothed, Berta, was stolen by the Merkit tribe. For months, he searched, haunted by rumors, that she had been defiled, enslaved, perhaps killed. When he finally rescued her, she was pregnant. The child could have been his, or his enemy's. Temujin never knew for certain. But in that moment, something crystallized in his mind. Not rage, but calculation. Women were not just spoils of war. They were the soil in which empires grow. Control the soil, and you control the harvest for generations. He watched how defeated tribes mourned. Men threw themselves from cliffs or drank poison rather than live in shame. But women? Women endured. They bore children. They raised sons who remembered the names of their mother's captors, and sometimes, over time, began to call those captors father. Temujin saw not weakness in this survival, but opportunity. If he could harness it, if he could systematize it, he wouldn't need to garrison every city. The conquered would become Mongol from within. Their blood would forget its origin. Their children would speak his tongue, ride his horses, worship his sky. By 1206, when the tribes united and proclaimed him Genghis Khan, the oceanic ruler, he had already begun to build what his inner circle called the eternal sowing. It was not myth, it was protocol, and its first full test came in 1209, against the Tangut Empire. The Mongols did not arrive as a horde of savages. They came with scribes, census takers, and physicians trained in the rhythms of the female body. Weeks before the siege, spies had infiltrated the cities, compiling lists. How many women? What ages? Which families held noble blood? Which showed signs of robust health? When the walls fell, the sorting began. Men were slaughtered or chained. Women were categorized. Primary breeders, ages 14 to 30, unmarked by disease or injury. Secondary, 31 to 40, proven mothers, valuable for their experience. The rest, girls too young, women too old, the sick, the frail, were simply erased. The chosen were marked with indelible ink on the wrist, a number, not a name. From that moment, they ceased to be Zaria or Layla or Aisha. They became Unit 7342B, assigned to Caravan Gamma, bound for the mobile breeding camps that followed the army like a second shadow. These were not mere prisoner trains. They were rolling factories of human capital, specially designed wagons, partitioned, ventilated, guarded, carried women in stages, newly captured, confirmed pregnant, postpartum, or deemed unproductive. Mongol physicians, drawing on knowledge from China, Persia, and the steppe, administered herbal tonics to hasten ovulation, prescribed diets rich in mare's milk and millet to strengthen uterine health, and even performed crude surgeries to correct conditions that might hinder conception. Every pregnancy was logged, every birth inspected. If the child showed Mongol traits, broad cheekbones, epicanthic folds, sturdy limbs, it was taken to be raised in a warrior's tent. If not, it vanished before dawn. The horror was not in the violence alone, but in its paperwork. Each act of violation was recorded with the same care as a shipment of silk or a tally of horses. Administrators calculated monthly reproductive yield and fertility efficiency per unit. This was not chaos. This was order weaponized. And in that order, humanity was reduced to metrics. Yet even in this machine, resistance flickered. Women whispered names to their newborns before they were taken. They carved secret symbols into their skin. They starved themselves slowly, or induced fevers with infected wounds. Anything to render their bodies useless to the system. Some poisoned their own milk. Others smothered their infants rather than let them grow up as tools of the empire that destroyed their mothers. For this, they were made examples, tortured publicly, their suffering turned into theater to break the spirit of the rest. But Genghis Khan did not see this as cruelty. He saw it as necessity. He was not building an empire for his lifetime. He was engineering a species. And by 1211, as he turned his gaze toward the mighty Jin dynasty of northern China, the system was ready to scale. In the city of Zhongdu alone, over 40,000 women of childbearing age were catalogued, branded, and loaded onto wagons that stretched for miles behind the advancing army. By 1213, the network spanned continents, caravans moving from the Gobi to the Caspian, each woman a seed planted in the future soil of Mongol dominance. This was the truth no chronicle dared name. Genghis Khan did not just conquer the world, he inseminated it. The silence that followed the fall of Zhongdu was not empty. It was thick, with ash, with grief, and with the low rhythmic creak of wagon wheels carrying what the Mongols called living tribute. 40,000 women had been processed in less than a month. Not captured, not imprisoned, processed, like grain, like timber, like horses. Each step refined by trial, error, and ruthless observation. By now the system had its own language, its own rituals, its own cold logic. And at its center stood a truth so disturbing, it was never spoken aloud, even among the Khan's closest generals. The real war was not fought with arrows and siege engines. It was fought in the dark, quiet space between a woman's hips. Genghis Khan had learned from every campaign. After the Tangut, he knew noble women bore children with finer features, lighter skin, narrower eyes, children more easily absorbed into the Mongol elite. So in China, the daughters of ministers and generals were separated immediately, given slightly cleaner tents, fed better rations, not out of mercy, but strategy. Their sons would one day govern Persia or rule in Kiev, and they needed to look the part. Meanwhile, peasant women, tough, weathered, fertile, were moved in herds, valued for endurance, not elegance. They would populate the frontier garrisons, bear the laborers and foot soldiers of the next generation. Every class, every ethnicity, slotted into the machine like gears in a clock, forged from bone and blood. And the machine never stopped. Behind the army, a second army moved, silent, unseen, relentless. Midwives trained in steppe medicine monitored cycles. Scribes updated ledgers by lamplight. Guards patrolled the perimeter of the breeding camps, not to keep enemies out, but to keep women in. Escape was rare, not because the fences were high, but because hope had been surgically removed. What was the point of running when your child would be left behind? When your village was ash? When your name no longer existed in any record that mattered? The Mongols understood that the deepest chains are not iron, but memory erased. Yet memory persisted, in songs hummed under breath, in knots tied in hair to mark the days since capture, in the way a mother would press her forehead to her daughters before the separation at 3 months. The precise moment the Mongols had determined broke a woman's will without killing her spirit entirely. 3 months of closeness, just enough to forge love, then ripped away. The child to a foster Mongol family, the mother back to the caravan, now hollowed, now compliant. It was psychological engineering centuries ahead of its time. By 1219, when Genghis turned west toward the Khwarezmian Empire, a realm of glittering cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, and Merv, he brought not just cavalry, but doctrine. The system was no longer experimental. It was doctrine refined in the blood-soaked fields of China, tested in the deserts of the Tangut, and now ready for its grandest stage. The Khwarezmians thought they were facing an invasion. They were facing a harvest. In Bukhara, after the gates fell, the Mongols did not burn the libraries first. They secured the census records. They wanted to know who was who had daughters of marriageable age, who had wives known for beauty or intelligence, who had sisters hidden in harems. Within hours, the sorting began, not in the streets, but in the courtyards of palaces, with the precision of surgeons. Women were stripped of jewelry, then of clothing, then of identity. A number was inked onto their wrist. Some wept, most did not. They had seen the pyramids of skulls outside the city walls. They understood the price of defiance. But what happened next defied even their darkest expectations. The Mongols did not rape them in alleys or tents, as conquerors had done since time immemorial. They scheduled it. Officers rotated through the caravans on a roster. Fertility windows were tracked. Conception was not left to chance. It was optimized. Herbal concoctions brewed from steppe plants induced ovulation. Women were paired with specific men based on lineage, rank, and physical traits. Genghis himself, his sons, his top generals, they were not just warriors. They were stud bulls in a global breeding program. Their seed deployed like strategic reserves. And the children were the true spoils. Born in mobile birthing wagons lined with felt and heated by dung fires, they were inspected within hours of birth. A panel of elders, part physician, part eugenicist, would examine the infant's skull shape, eye fold, limb proportion. If deemed suitable, the child was taken to be raised as Mongol, taught to ride before walking, to shoot before speaking. If not, a quiet walk into the desert at night. No ceremony, no grave, just sand reclaiming what the empire deemed unworthy. This was the secret no Persian poet dared write, no Chinese minister recorded. Genghis Khan was not building an empire of land. He was building an empire of blood. And blood, once spilled into the gene pool, cannot be unspilled. The scale was industrial. By 1220, over 200,000 women moved in synchronized caravans across Eurasia, from the Yellow River to the Volga, from the Hindu Kush to the Black Sea. Supply depots stocked with dried mare's milk, medicinal herbs, clean linens. Mobile clinics staffed by physicians who spoke Turkic, Persian, and Chinese. Even retirement protocols. Women who had borne 3 healthy sons were sometimes granted small plots near garrison towns, their service complete. They were not freed. They were repurposed as wet nurses, as weavers, as living monuments to the system's success. And all of it was documented, not in secret scrolls hidden from history, but in plain sight, in Mongol administrative records later copied by Persian scribes, in Chinese court archives that noted the disappearance of entire female populations, in the quiet gaps in family trees across Central Asia. The evidence was always there. We just refused to read it, because to read it is to confront a truth that haunts the present. Every time a man in Istanbul, Delhi, or Novosibirsk spits into a DNA test tube and sees Mongol ancestry, he is not just seeing the legacy of a warrior, he is seeing the legacy of a system that turned rape into policy, motherhood into machinery, and human beings into vectors of imperial permanence. Genghis Khan died in 1227, during yet another campaign against the Tangut, perhaps poisoned, perhaps by fever, perhaps by the weight of his own ambition. But his death changed nothing. The caravans kept moving. His sons, Joshi, Chagatai, Ogedei, Tolui, inherited not just lands but breeding quotas. Ogedei expanded the system into Eastern Europe. Hulagu applied it during the sack of Baghdad. Kublai refined it in Yuan China, blending Mongol efficiency with Confucian bureaucracy to create the most sophisticated reproductive control apparatus the world had ever seen. And at Genghis's funeral, as legend says, 40 noble maidens were buried alive with him, sacrificed to serve him in the next life. But the real sacrifice happened far from the tomb. In the days after his death, thousands of women in the caravans were executed, not out of rage, but protocol. too dangerous to leave unguarded during the succession. Their bodies dumped in mass graves, unmarked, unmourned. Only now, 8 centuries later, are archaeologists finding them. Young women, often with fetal remains in their wombs, buried without ritual, without honor, without names. Near Bukhara, one grave held a mother and her teenage daughter, DNA confirmed. Isotopes showed the girl had traveled hundreds of miles before she died. She was Zaria, or someone just like her, and her story is not over. It lives in the Y chromosome of 16 million men. It echoes in the silence of history books that called her spoils. It whispers in the blood of anyone who carries the genetic shadow of an empire that understood the most terrifying truth of all. You can lose every battle, but if you win the womb, you win forever. But the women knew something the Khan never could, that even in the darkest system a whisper can carry. A name can survive, a song can outlive an empire, and though they were erased from records, they were never erased from each other. In the cold nights of the caravan they held hands, they shared bread, they named their unborn children in secret, and in doing so, they kept something the Mongols could never conquer. The unbreakable thread of human dignity, spun not in palaces or on battlefields, but in the quiet, defiant act of remembering who you are, even when the world insists you are nothing but a number. That thread still runs through us, and it always will. The thread did not snap. Not in the caravans, not in the birthing wagons, not even in the mass graves where bones now lie tangled like roots beneath the steppe. It held because the women wove it with something the Mongols could never quantify: memory. Not the kind written on parchment, but the kind carried in lullabies, in the curve of a hand gesture, in the way a mother's eyes linger on her child just a second too long before surrendering her to the inspectors. These were acts of rebellion so small they left no trace in the ledgers, yet so powerful they outlived empires. And it was this invisible resistance that Genghis Khan, for all his genius, failed to account for. He could map the stars, calculate the trajectory of an arrow across a mile of wind, orchestrate the movement of 500,000 men across continents, but he could not control what a woman whispered into her daughter's ear in the dark. By 1221, the Khwarezmian heartland was a graveyard of cities. Merv, once home to 500,000 souls, was reduced to silence. The Mongols claimed they killed 1.3 million there, but numbers lie. What they don't capture is the aftermath. The women who walked out of the ruins not as survivors, but as inventory. They were marched east in columns so long they took 3 days to pass a single point. No chains, no ropes, just exhaustion, and the certainty that anywhere was better than the charnel house behind them. Among them was a Persian poet's wife, once famed for her knowledge of astronomy, now reduced to Unit 8819C. She carried with her one thing the Mongols hadn't confiscated: the names of the stars. At night, when the guards slept, she would point to Vega or Sirius and whisper their Persian names to the girl beside her. A girl who had once been a silk merchant's daughter in Samarkand. Those names became their secret language, their map back to themselves. This was the paradox of the system. The more efficient it became, the more it created spaces for subversion. In the breeding camps, women from different lands, Chinese, Persian, Georgian, Russian, found common ground not in shared language, but in shared violation. They developed gestures. A tap on the wrist meant, "The guards are watching." A hand over the belly meant, "I'm with child." 3 slow blinks meant, "Tonight, we try to escape." They shared methods to induce miscarriage: chewing bitter roots, pressing sharp stones against the abdomen, drinking teas brewed from poisonous nightshade. Some succeeded, others died, but each attempt was a declaration: "My body is not yours." The Mongols responded with ever more refined control. They assigned compliance monitors, women from earlier caravans who had accepted their fate, now tasked with reporting dissent. They introduced reward systems, extra rations for those who bore sons, lighter duties for those who stopped resisting. They even staged public ceremonies where loyal mothers were reunited with their Mongol-raised children, carefully scripted performances designed to break the spirit of the rest. But these tactics only deepened the underground network. The women learned to feign compliance, to smile while their eyes stayed cold, to nod while their hands traced forbidden symbols in the dirt. And then there were the songs. No historian recorded them. No scribe thought them worth preserving, but they existed. Soft, wordless hums that carried the cadence of lost rivers, the rhythm of forgotten dances, a Georgian lullaby blended with a Uyghur morning chant, reshaped into something new, something shared. These songs did not speak of freedom, they spoke of before the soldiers came, before the numbers, before the silence. To sing them was to say, I was someone, I am still someone, and in the vast, indifferent machinery of the empire, that was the most dangerous idea of all. Genghis Khan never heard these songs. He rode ahead of the caravans, always forward, always expanding, but his sons did. Ogedei, who inherited the throne in 1229, was more pragmatic than his father. He saw the system not as a moral project, but as an economic one. Why waste women who could weave, cook, heal? Under his rule, the caravans evolved. Productive units were reassigned after childbirth, some to textile mills in Karakoram, others to kitchens in the imperial palace, others to serve as wet nurses for Mongol nobility. The goal remained the same, integration through utility. But the unintended consequence was contact. A Chinese weaver teaching her Mongol overseer how to dye silk with indigo. A Persian midwife saving the life of a general's wife during childbirth. Slowly, subtly, the conquerors began to absorb the conquered, not just genetically, but culturally. Yet the core of the system remained untouched. The breeding caravans still rolled. The inspections still happened. The unwanted infants still vanished. And the Y chromosome of the Khan's line still spread. Through coercion, through calculation, through the cold arithmetic of power. By the time Kublai Khan declared himself Emperor of China in 1271, the genetic footprint of the original program was already embedded across half the world. But something else had taken root too, a quiet, persistent counter-narrative carried not in blood, but in story. Centuries later, in villages from the Caucasus to Manchuria, old women would tell their grandchildren tales of the Great Taking, a time when the sky turned black with dust and the men disappeared and the women were led away like sheep. The details varied, but the core remained. A mother, a daughter, a separation, a promise whispered in the dark. These stories were dismissed as folklore, as myth, but now, with DNA and archaeology, we see they were history, distorted by time, yes, but rooted in truth. What Genghis Khan did to enemy wives was not just brutal, it was visionary in its cruelty. He understood that the most enduring conquest is not of land, but of lineage, that a child raised to call his rapist father will never rise against him. That identity, once reshaped, becomes self-perpetuating. And for a time it worked. The Mongol Empire fragmented, but the bloodlines held. The language faded, but the genes remained. But here is what the Khan could not foresee. Memory is also hereditary, not in DNA but in culture, in the way a grandmother teaches her granddaughter to braid her hair, in the recipe passed down for a dish no longer eaten in its homeland, in the stubborn refusal to forget a name, even when every record says it never existed. The women of the caravans knew they would not live to see justice, but they believed, fiercely, silently, that someone, someday, would remember, and now we do. We remember because the silence finally broke. Not in the 13th century, not in the centuries of dust and denial that followed, but in our own time, when science gave voice to bones and data gave shape to ghosts. The first crack came in 2003, when a team of geneticists published a study that sent shockwaves through academia. A single Y chromosome lineage, originating in Mongolia around 1,000 years ago, was carried by roughly 8% of men across a vast swath of Asia. 16 million souls in total. The timing, the geography, the sheer scale pointed to one man, not a myth, not a legend, Genghis Khan, or someone so close to him, his father, his sons, his brothers, that the distinction hardly mattered. The empire hadn't just left ruins, it had left descendants, millions of them, and with that discovery, the hidden architecture of his conquest snapped into focus. But the genetic evidence only told half the story. It revealed the outcome, not the mechanism. How could one man, or even a dynasty, seed an entire continent? The answer, buried in Persian chronicles, Chinese court records, and the fragmented testimonies of survivors, was chilling in its simplicity. It wasn't just Genghis. It was the system, the caravans, the classifications, the breeding camps that moved like shadows behind the army, the women who vanished from history, but whose children did not. The Y chromosome didn't spread through love or consent. It spread through control, systematic, bureaucratic, industrialized control over the most intimate act of human life. And yet, even as science confirmed the scale of the genetic conquest, it risked erasing the women all over again. Headlines screamed, "Genghis Khan's super sperm!" as if this were a tale of virility, not violence. Documentaries celebrated his biological legacy with awe, not outrage. The women, the mothers, the daughters, the silenced, were reduced to passive vessels, their trauma glossed over as the inevitable cost of empire. But they were not passive. They were participants in a war they never chose, fighting with the only weapons left to them: memory, resistance, and the quiet refusal to let their children forget. Consider the girl from Bukhara, the one buried beside her mother. Isotopic analysis of her teeth showed she had spent her early years in the fertile valleys of the Amu Darya, Persian soil, Persian water. But in her final months, her diet shifted. More millet, more dairy, the food of the steppe. She had been taken, moved, processed. And yet, in her bones, scientists found something else. Signs of chronic stress, yes, but also evidence of care. Her mother had shared her rations even in starvation. She had held her close, even in chains. That tenderness, invisible to the Mongol scribes, survived 8 centuries in calcium and collagen. It is the counterweight to the horror. Even in the darkest machine, love persisted. This is the duality of the legacy. On one side, a genetic empire built on coercion, a lineage that thrives because it was forced into existence. On the other, a cultural resistance that refused to die, carried not in chromosomes, but in songs, in scars, in the way a woman in modern-day Uzbekistan still braids her daughter's hair, in a pattern no one can trace but feels ancient in her fingers. The Mongols won the bloodline, but the women won the soul, and that soul speaks to us now, not in grand monuments, but in fragments. In a Persian poem from the 1250s, hidden in the margins of a medical text, a line reads, "They took our names, but not our voices." In a Chinese archive from the Yuan dynasty, a single entry notes the execution of 3 women for teaching forbidden lullabies. In a Georgian monastery, a fresco painted in secret shows Mary not with Joseph, but with another woman, her sister, her friend, her fellow captive, both gazing protectively at the child between them. These are not proofs. They are echoes, but echoes are enough when the silence has lasted 800 years. What haunts us is not just what was done, but how easily it was forgotten. How history glorified the conqueror and erased the conquered. How textbooks called it integration when it was erasure. How we celebrated the Mongol Empire for its postal system, its religious tolerance, its military genius, and said nothing of the caravans that followed in its wake. But the truth has a way of resurfacing. Bones speak, DNA testifies. And the descendants, both the 16 million men and the countless women whose lineages were severed or reshaped, now ask the same question. Whose story gets to be remembered? Genghis Khan believed he had solved the problem of impermanence. Empires fall, he knew. Dynasties crumble. But if your blood runs in the veins of the future, you never truly die. He was right, partly. His genes endure, but so does the resistance. And in the end, it is not the conqueror who shapes the future, but those who refuse to let the truth be buried. Because the real haunting isn't the ghost of Genghis Khan. It's the whisper of Zarya, still asking to be named. The whisper of Zarya did not fade. It multiplied. It echoed in the throat of every woman who bit her tongue to keep a secret, in the fingers of every mother who traced her child's face one last time before letting go, in the silence between heartbeats when survival meant forgetting your own name. And centuries later, that whisper found new voices. Not in the dust of Khorasan, but in the sterile glow of DNA labs, in the quiet intensity of archaeologists brushing sand from femurs, in the trembling hands of a man in Kazakhstan opening his ancestry report and seeing Mongol 34% beside a photo of his daughter, her eyes wide with questions he cannot answer. This is where the haunting becomes personal, not abstract, not historical, but intimate, because the legacy of Genghis Khan is not confined to textbooks or museum displays. It lives in bedrooms, in family trees, in the unspoken tension when a grandfather refuses to speak of the past. In Turkey, a young man learns his Y chromosome matches the star cluster, the genetic signature of the Khan's line, and wonders, does this make him heir to an empire or to a crime? In Mongolia, a woman spits into a test tube, not for curiosity, but for reckoning. seeking proof that her ancestors were not just warriors, but also the taken, the silenced, the erased. The data does not comfort, it accuses. And yet, even as science gives us answers, it risks flattening the truth into statistics. 16 million men, 1 in 200, 8% in Mongolia. These numbers are staggering, but they are also dehumanizing. They turn trauma into trivia, conquest into a genetic party trick. What they cannot capture is the weight of a single moment. A girl in 1220, standing in the dust, watching her mother disappear over the horizon, knowing she will never hear her real name spoken again. That moment is not a data point. It is a wound, and wounds do not heal when they are ignored. They fester. But healing begins with naming. In recent years, a quiet movement has emerged, not among historians, but among descendants. Women in Central Asia have begun gathering in circles, sharing family stories long buried under shame or fear. They speak of great-grandmothers who never smiled, who flinched at the sound of hooves, who refused to let their daughters marry soldiers. They speak of lullabies sung in languages no one remembers, of rituals performed at dawn to honor unnamed ancestors. These are not acts of vengeance. They are acts of restoration. To say, we were here, we suffered, we survived, and men are joining them, not to defend the Khan, but to confront the legacy they carry in their blood. Some have started DNA projects to trace not just paternal lines, but maternal ones, seeking the women history forgot. Others have funded excavations of mass graves, insisting that the dead be given names, not numbers. One man in Kyrgyzstan, upon learning his Y chromosome links him to Genghis, donated land for a memorial, not to the conqueror, but to the women of the caravans. My blood may come from him, he said, but my conscience comes from them. This is the reckoning the Mongols never anticipated. They built a system to erase identity, but identity is stubborn. It hides in mitochondria, in oral tradition, in the way a grandmother's hands move when she kneads dough. And now, after 800 years, it is rising, not with swords, but with stories, because the true power was never in the Khan's seed. It was in the women's silence, and in their decision, finally, to break it. What Genghis Khan did to enemy wives was to treat them as resources, as tools, as future factories of loyalty. But in doing so, he made them the most dangerous force in his empire. Witnesses. They saw the machine from the inside. They knew its rhythms, its weaknesses, its lies. And though they could not stop it in their lifetime, they planted seeds of truth that would bloom centuries later. Now, those seeds are flowering. In classrooms, teachers are rewriting lessons, not to glorify conquest, but to center the conquered. In museums, exhibits are being redesigned to show not just Mongol armor, but the weaving tools of captive women, the tiny amulets they hid in their hair, the fragments of poetry scratched onto pottery shards. In literature, novels are being written from the perspective of the caravans, not as victims, but as strategists, as survivors, as keepers of flame in a world gone dark. This is how empires truly fall, not when their armies are defeated, but when their narrative is dismantled. Genghis Khan won the battlefield, but the women won the story, and the story is still being told. Every time a girl learns that her great-great-grandmother was more than a footnote. Every time a man chooses empathy over pride. Every time we look at a DNA result not as a trophy, but as a responsibility, then Zarya is remembered. Then the mother in Khorasan is honored. Then the system is not just exposed, but undone. Because memory is the final frontier of justice, and we are just beginning to cross it. The frontier of memory is not crossed in a day. It is walked step by step, bone by bone, name by name. And in the last decade, that walk has led us to places the Mongols never imagined their secrets would be unearthed. Not in palaces or battlefields, but in the quiet corners of forensic labs, in the hushed tones of oral historians, in the digital archives of ordinary people uploading family trees to the cloud. What was once buried beneath layers of sand and silence is now rising, not as accusation alone, but as reclamation. Consider the site near the Amudarya, where a team of Uzbek and Mongolian archaeologists uncovered a burial pit in 2018. At first glance, it looked like any other mass grave from the era. Disordered, shallow, devoid of grave goods. But as they sifted through the soil, they found something extraordinary. Among the skeletons of women, most between 15 and 30, were tiny clusters of fetal remains, not scattered but cradled. In 3 cases, the adult arms were curled around the smaller bones, as if in a final embrace. One woman had a small carved stone tucked into her palm, a fertility symbol from pre-Islamic Persia, outlawed under Mongol rule. She had kept it hidden, perhaps for years, until the end. These were not just bodies. They were testaments, and for the first time, science could read them. Isotopic analysis revealed diets that shifted abruptly, from wheat and lentils to millet and dairy, marking the moment of capture. DNA extracted from tooth pulp confirmed maternal lineages stretching from the Caucasus to the Gansu corridor. And in one jawbone, researchers found microscopic wear patterns consistent with constant whispering, suggesting the woman had spent her final months speaking softly, perhaps to a child, perhaps to herself, repeating names the world had tried to erase. This is how the invisible becomes visible, not through grand declarations, but through calcium, collagen, and carbon. And it's not just bones. In the mountains of Dagestan, an elderly woman recently shared a lullaby with a linguist, a melody passed down through 12 generations of women, never written, never recorded. When transcribed, its structure matched no known language, but contained Persian roots, Turkic rhythms, and Mongol vowel shifts. It was a hybrid song, born in the caravans, shaped by survival. "We sang it so the children would dream in our tongues," she said. Not theirs. That song is now archived in UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage database, not as folklore, but as resistance. This is the quiet revolution happening across Eurasia, the transformation of trauma into testimony. Descendants are no longer waiting for historians to validate their pain. They are becoming the historians. In Kazakhstan, a collective of women has compiled a digital map of silent sites, locations where caravans are believed to have stopped, based on family stories and landscape memory. In Iran, poets are writing verses in the voice of the taken wives, giving them back the language the empire stole. In Mongolia itself, once reluctant to confront the darker chapters of its imperial past, museums now include exhibits on the women behind the conquest, featuring replicas of the ink stamps used to mark wrists, alongside recordings of modern women reciting the names of their forgotten ancestors. And the men are listening. Not all, of course. Some still cling to the myth of the noble Khan, the unifier, the visionary. But others, especially the young, are asking harder questions. If my blood carries his legacy, what does that demand of me? Is it enough to feel shame? Or must I act? One university student in Ulaanbaatar started a project called Return the Names, inviting people to submit the female ancestors in their family trees who were listed only as wife of or mother of. Within months, they had recovered over 2,000 names. Amina, Layli, Tuya, Zora, women who had existed only as blanks in official records. Now, they are engraved on a memorial wall in the capital, not as victims, as people. This is how healing begins, not by erasing the past, but by restoring its fullness. Genghis Khan's system depended on dehumanization. Reduce a woman to a number, and you can do anything to her. But restore her name, her song, her story, and the machine cracks. Because empathy cannot coexist with anonymity. And that is why the haunting continues. Not to punish, but to remind. Every time a child asks, "Where do we come from?" and the answer includes not just warriors, but weavers, not just conquerors, but captives. That is the system being dismantled. Every time a DNA test leads not to pride, but to reflection. That is the legacy being transformed. Every time we choose to remember Zaria not as a statistic, but as a girl who loved her mother and feared the dark. That is justice, however delayed. The Mongols thought they could control the future by controlling reproduction. But they forgot one thing: memory is also inherited, not through chromosomes but through care. Through the way a grandmother holds your hand when she tells you a story. Through the tears in your father's eyes when he finally speaks of his grandmother's silence. Through the courage it takes to say, "This happened, and it matters." The caravans are gone. The wagons have rotted. The ink on those wrists has faded into dust. But the truth remains, carried not in blood alone, but in the unbroken chain of those who refuse to let it die. And that chain is growing stronger every day. The chain grows not in silence, but in sound. The sound of voices rising where only whispers once lived. Across the vast expanse once ruled by the shadow of the Khan, a new kind of caravan is forming. Not of wagons, but of words. Not of captives, but of witnesses. And this caravan moves not behind an army, but ahead of a reckoning. In 2023, a young woman in Samarkand uploaded a video to social media. She stood in the ruins of an old caravanserai, the same stones that once echoed with the footsteps of Mongol guards. In her hands, she held a fragment of pottery unearthed by her grandfather decades ago. On it, faint but legible, were two names scratched in Persian script: Zora and Layla. These were real women, she said, her voice steady despite the wind. Not units, not spoils, not footnotes. They had names. They had each other. And now, we have them. The video went viral, not because it was polished, but because it was true. Within weeks, thousands of people across Central Asia began sharing their own fragments. A locket with a faded inscription, a family recipe passed down with a whispered warning, a lullaby sung in a dialect no linguist had documented. This is the digital resurrection of the silenced. Where the Mongols erased identity with ink and iron, we are restoring it with pixels and persistence. Crowdsourced archives now map maternal lineages that official history ignored. Podcasts in Kazakh, Uzbek, and Persian tell the stories of the caravans from the inside, not as spectacle, but as survival. In classrooms from Bishkek to Beijing, students are taught not just how Genghis Khan conquered, but who he conquered, and what they carried with them into the darkness. And the most powerful act of all, naming the unnamed. Historians once dismissed the idea that we could recover the identities of the women in the caravans. No records exist, they said. But records exist in other forms. In the mitochondrial DNA passed from mother to child, in the oral genealogies kept by village elders, in the way certain families still avoid eating lamb on the anniversary of a city's fall. One researcher in Almaty spent 10 years cross-referencing Chinese tax rolls, Persian merchant logs, and Mongol military dispatches. She found discrepancies, gaps where women should have been listed but weren't. Then she turned to local folklore. In one village, a tale spoke of the 40 sisters taken in the year of the horse. She matched that year to 1222. Then she found a mass grave near the old caravan route. Carbon dating confirmed it. And in the soil, among the bones, was a single silver earring stamped with a floral motif unique to that village. That earring now sits in a glass case in a museum in Tashkent. Beside it, a plaque reads, "In memory of the 40 sisters. Their names are lost. Their presence is not." This is how history is rewritten, not by erasing the conqueror, but by centering the conquered. Genghis Khan's genius was in seeing the future as a genetic project, but his blindness was in believing that blood alone defines legacy. He did not account for culture, the stubborn, singing, storytelling force that outlives empires. The women of the caravans knew this. They couldn't stop the system, but they could seed an alternative future. One built not on domination, but on remembrance, and that future is now. When a man in Istanbul learns his Y chromosome links him to the Khan, he has a choice: to wear it as a badge of pride, or to carry it as a burden of responsibility. More and more they are choosing the latter. Support groups have formed for descendants who grapple with this inheritance, not to deny it, but to transform it. They fund scholarships for girls in regions once ravaged by the Mongols. They sponsor archaeological digs that prioritize female remains. They commission artists to create works honoring the taken wives, not as passive figures, but as guardians of memory. This is not guilt, this is grace. Because the true measure of a legacy is not how far it spreads, but how deeply it listens. And the world is finally listening to Zaria, not as a symbol, not as a statistic, but as a girl who existed, who breathed, who feared, who loved, and whose story, once buried under the weight of empire, now rises like dawn over the steppe, quiet, inevitable, and full of light. The dawn does not erase the night, it reveals what the darkness hid. And in that light, we see not just the horror of what was done, but the holiness of what endured. For 8 centuries, the story of Genghis Khan was told as a saga of unity, of vision, of world-shaping will. And it was all true, just not the whole truth. The full story includes the mother in Khorasan who watched her daughter walk into history as a number. It includes the Persian poet's wife who whispered star names in a breeding camp. It includes the 40 sisters buried with only an earring to say they were ever here. This is the reckoning. Not to tear down the Khan, but to expand the frame. To say, yes, he built an empire, but on whose backs? To say, yes, his blood runs in millions, but at what cost to those who carried it? And the cost was not just physical, it was ontological. To be stripped of your name is to be unmade. To have your child taken is to be severed from the future. To be reduced to a reproductive unit is to be denied your humanity. The Mongols understood that the deepest conquest is not of land, but of self, and for centuries they succeeded. The women vanished from records, their cultures blurred. Their pain was folded into the silence of how things were. But silence is not emptiness. It is containment, and what was contained could not be destroyed. Now, in our time, the vessel has cracked open, not through war but through witness, through a grandmother's lullaby, through a DNA test, through a girl in Samarkand holding a shard of pottery with 2 names. These acts seem small against the scale of empire, but they are the only things that outlast it. Empires fall, dynasties fade, but a name spoken in love, that echoes forever. What haunts us is not the ghost of Genghis Khan. It is the realization that we are all living inside the aftermath of systems designed to erase, not just in the 13th century, but today, in every place where bodies are commodified, where women are silenced, where identity is stripped for the sake of control. The Mongol caravans were extreme, but not unique. They were a mirror, and in that mirror we see not just the past, but the patterns that still walk among us. Yet there is hope, not in denial, but in repair. Every time we choose to say a name instead of a number, we undo a piece of the system. Every time we honor a maternal line as fiercely as a paternal one, we rebalance history. Every time we teach our children that conquest is not glory unless it includes the conquered, we build a different future. This is the legacy we inherit, not just the blood, but the choice. The 16 million men with the Khan's Y chromosome carry a paradox in their veins. They are both heirs to violence and vessels of possibility. They can let the past define them, or they can redefine the past. And many are choosing the latter. Not with shame, but with service. Not with silence, but with song. Because the final truth is this: Genghis Khan did not win. He spread his seed across continents, yes. He bent nations to his will, yes. He built a machine of such efficiency it reshaped the human map, yes. But he failed to extinguish the one thing that matters most: the human insistence on being seen. The women of the caravans are seen now. Zarya has a face. The mother has a voice. The 40 sisters have a memorial. And their story is no longer hidden in the margins. It is central to how we understand power, memory, and what it means to survive. So let the haunting continue, not as a curse, but as a compass. Let it guide us to look beyond the conqueror's statue and ask, who stood in his shadow? Let it move us to listen not just to the roar of armies, but to the whisper in the dark. Let it remind us that the most powerful act of resistance is often the simplest, to remember who you are and to say it out loud. The caravans are gone. The ink has faded. But the names are returning, and with them the world is finally learning the truth. Empires are built on blood, but humanity is built on memory, and memory always wins.